I want to thank everybody for coming and attending our final committee meeting on Preservation of the Hope Scholarship. Chairman Ramsey's running a little late, so we're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. So he will be here, but he's probably going to be 30 minutes late or so. Y'all have an agenda, and we're gonna make a few modifications to it because we have someone who needs to catch a flight. So we're going to Representative Stevens, Mr. Chairman, we're going to move you down a little bit and myself down on our presentation, and we're going to start off with Rich Baldwin, Managing Director, Global Head of Union Gaming Analytics, Las Vegas. So is Rich here? If you could, I know you're the one that needs to catch a flight, so come on up and you can go to the podium. Do you have a presentation or? Okay, they'll help you load it up. Well, welcome.
Good morning, and good morning, members of the committee. Thank you for accommodating my travel schedule and being so hospitable. I do appreciate that, and allowing me to reverse the order here a little bit. Appreciate the opportunity to present here today in front of the committee. Again, my name is Rich Baldwin. I represent, I'm the managing director of our firm, Union Gaming Group. As noted on the slide here, I'm not a learner. A colleague of mine presented to the same committee a few months ago, and we actually just didn't get around to updating that on the slide. Just a few minutes about Union Gaming Group. We are a boutique investment bank and securities firm. We are focused exclusively on the global gaming industry, global casino and integrated resort industry. We are uniquely based in Las Vegas, Macau, Hong Kong, and New York City. We specialize in equity research, securities trading, investment banking services, for a broad range of clients, which include casino operators, local real estate partners, governments, and institutional money managers. Through our Union Gaming Analytics subsidiary, which is a subsidiary that I head up for the firm globally, we also provide gaming market studies, feasibility work, and various market analysis for public and government entities. Just 20 seconds of my background. I've been working in the gaming industry now for 25 years or so. I have spent time on the corporate side, both with casino operating companies as well as gaming technology companies. Throughout the span of my career, started in public accounting, also serving predominantly gaming clients based in Las Vegas with Deloitte & Touche, and have been with Union Gaming now for about 3 years. So today we're going to present what we're referring to as a Wall Street perspective on casino gaming finance. What we've listed here, what we would consider some key factors and things that need to be considered in regards to casino finance and regulation. First and foremost, you really only have one chance to get it right. Every change to the legislation matters. The right structure can potentiate the optimization of investment. to run and operate destination casino resorts. Let's talk about gaming tax rates. We certainly believe there is a strong inverse relationship between tax rate and investment, and we'll provide some examples here in a second. There is a direct relationship between investment and jobs, the quality of the amenities, tourism, and vendor spending. Important to keep in mind when considering what an appropriate gaming tax rate should be, that states are competing with facilities, amenities, and tax rates in neighboring jurisdictions. Also recognizing that whatever those tax rates are or whatever those amenities are in neighboring jurisdictions, they will change. The market, one thing's for certain is that the market will change. And so we would certainly always advocate having a long-term view when considering what is an appropriate gaming tax rate for that's specific to the particular market that's being studied. What we've listed here is just a sampling of the effective gaming tax rates or range of rates in these jurisdictions here that we've listed. And so you can see they are ranging as high as 67.5% or as low as 35.5%. And I think it's pretty well understood and documented, and again would require, I believe, more research to really understand what's below here. But certainly these higher gaming tax rates definitely hinder the overall investment and the budgets for these particular projects and the resulting amenities. And to be clear, when I say amenities, I'm referring to the amenities other than gaming, which we'll come back to in a minute as well. Actually, just as a side note, the 67.5% rate there for New York casinos, some of them actually are paying an effective rate closer to 70%. So on this slide, we are presenting what we are demonstrating that there is a very strong inverse relationship between tax rate and investment, and a direct relationship between investment and jobs, quality of amenities, tourism, and vendor spending. Again, states are competing, markets change, competition changes, the amenities in neighboring markets change. So it's certainly never easy to predict the future, nor am I suggesting our firm has the ability to do that. We're merely pointing out that one must think longer term in orientation when considering something such as important as setting that initial gaming tax rate. Here in Nevada, you can see on the low end, roughly 7% or so, and then you have New York casinos. On the previous slide, we mentioned racinos, so racetracks with slots. In this case, there were 4 casino licenses recently awarded in the state, and the tax rate there is lower than what the racetrack casinos are currently being taxed at. So again, we would argue that among U.S. markets, low gaming tax rates can certainly promote higher investment per property. Here we just another way to present what I just discussed on the last 2 slides, essentially showing the relationship between the effective tax rate and the level of investment and reinvestment. As I alluded to, Georgia will be competing with facilities, other amenities, and tax rates in neighboring jurisdictions. This includes in the immediate region, as we would think about it, Alabama, Florida, and North Carolina. As we've stated here, in Alabama, you have the porch band of Creek Indians. Certainly, I think most folks are aware of the initiative that's underway there, or has been. Florida, of course, you have the Seminole Tribe. You can see what the tax rates are there, and then North Carolina. And so, when we think about, this particular region, or when we deem kind of the what's in the area that ultimately
destination resort casinos in the state would be competing with, this is what it looks like today. Certainty. So let's talk a little bit about the RFP process. So certainties, what are the benefits? Certainties beyond defined tax rate structures, including parameters, burdens to entry. Certainty will fuel commitments. Uncertainty is not a good thing. I think that's fairly logical, but we highlight it nonetheless. Significant investment is made more palatable with visibility into hurdles in place that ward off the possibility of referendum or future legislative action, which could result in unexpected competition. It's quite often the case that when casino-style, resort-style gaming is being considered in new jurisdictions, those parties that are interested in developing and operating such facilities of course, are always going to be interested in some sort of exclusivity that will allow them some protection to make sure they achieve an adequate return on their investment, and ultimately building a business that is viable for the long term. And so in an environment where there's lots of uncertainty around those types of things, certainly that could hinder what one might be willing to spend. And so it's the notion of certainty to the extent that you can't make everything certain, but there are certain things that you can. And so we simply highlight this as a consideration. As I mentioned, the competitive RFP process allows a market to maximize its opportunity. We firmly believe in this. There are, and there have been, there will be continued attempts on behalf of certain groups that will, in certain cases, try and front run, if you will, a competitive RFP process. They will come in and suggest, I'm the best, and you should only work with me, and here's why. I would tell you that you're seeing a little more of that in certain international jurisdictions these days, where we've seen some of that activity, but I think domestically, that's, in our view, a big no-no. I think you really want to have a very open and competitive RFP process, the result of which should ultimately, one would hope, come to the best decisions made based on the best available information. Just getting into some of the particulars of the RFP, a formalized, deliberate RFP process allows the state a forum, of course, in which to outline clear objectives, provides an opportunity, to clarify the intended or proposed tax structure, defining goals with respect to target markets and tourism, whether primarily intra-state or interstate, setting expectations with respect to the development and project scale. For example, establishing minimum investment thresholds. So as I alluded to earlier, I think this committee is kind of uniquely positioned in that there's been a significant body of work that's been done. Our firm has played a very small part, if you will, because there are lots of folks out there that have been participating in some fashion, in this expansion of resort-style casino gaming across the U.S. for the past 20 to 30 years. And so, I think as I suggest that our piece has been a small piece. Well, I feel that we've learned a lot as well, and we've been involved in a lot of different ways, but so have others. And so the point is that there's lots of folks out there that certainly have views that you can learn and experiences you can draw from as well. And we're appreciative of the opportunity to come here today and present our opinions and what we've learned. So again, so these are a couple of different approaches, right? So we just highlight a few here just to understand how certain things have come to be the way that they have. So if we look at Delaware, Rhode Island, West Virginia, we're referring to this as a phased or rolled out approach, piecemeal. In these particular states, they opted for an approach to pursue VLTs first, with intent to add table games, sometime down the road. Rationale was to minimize initial investment, thereby facilitating speed to market. That's an important point, that maybe is worth another minute or two on. We've seen kind of behavior that may not always be conducive for long-term thinking or long-term good decision making, because there's a desire to plug some immediate gap, and you see that. I don't necessarily want to pick on anybody in particular, but that mentality seems to be somewhat prevalent, as in our view, as we are out talking and working with various states and or casino developers that are pursuing new licenses in new jurisdictions or additional licenses in existing jurisdictions. And so I would contend that is just not the way to think about it. It shouldn't be a short-term thought. It really should be more long-term in orientation. So here again, as we mentioned, the rationale was to minimize initial investment, speed to market. Speed to market doesn't always end up in the best product and something that will be competitive for the long term. And so in the instance of Delaware, Rhode Island, West Virginia, what ultimately you have is the intended result was, in essence, to establish a local-centric market as opposed to a destination market. Let's talk about an integrated approach. In the case of Louisiana, Massachusetts, Mississippi, at the outset, it was clearly understood and known that the opportunity there, or what was the stage was set to pursue large-scale development at the outset of casino gaming implementation. The states embraced casino gaming as part of their overall tourism and economic development identity. They sanctioned large-scale projects purpose-built for economic growth for their states, and certainly took a longer-term horizon, considering how these developments could be complementary or cooperative with broader state tourism initiatives. One thing I will say, that is something that we are seeing working quite well in a lot of international markets, where you really do have very good symmetry there in terms of really trying to tie in these destination casino resorts as a means to really induce country visitation, more or less country visitation. Then, of course, where do you put them in the country? Where does it make the most sense? How do you yield the most economic benefit? Do we want to go somewhere where there's already a lot of people, or do we want to try and develop another area where we can stimulate demand in another area? All of these things have to be considered. But I say there definitely are, some of the international markets, I think, kind of the governmental bodies that are have already implemented or considering implementing resort-style gaming. I think that there's some good lessons to be learned there as well. We pick on Kansas a little bit here, just from the perspective of, and in full disclosure, our firm worked with the state of Kansas in the most recent rebid of the licenses, but in the initial attempt, the conditions that were set in the RFP were overly restrictive, and ultimately there were no bidders at the levels that were established and with the restrictions that were in place. So that concludes my prepared remarks. Again, appreciate the opportunity to come and present here today, and welcome to take any questions.
Mr. Baldwin, thank you for your presentation. Do we have any questions? I have one quick question. I think you said Delaware said they were just going to start with VLTs because of cost. And I wanted to ask you, are the VLTs owned by the state, or are they owned by a private entity? Like, for example, our lottery machines, when you buy Mega Millions,
yeah,
we own that machine. It's tied into our system. Yep. So is the VLT tied into a lottery corporation system?
Video lottery terminals there, I believe. That's the case in Delaware. Yes, a different model ultimately, because they are not what I would deem or what we would deem a resort casino. They are a kind kind of local video lottery facility that's serving the local population.
So would you recommend, if the state was going to go to just VLTs to start with, that the state owns the machines, or do you have someone else own them?
Well, I think our view here would, I mean, before I answer that, I think first of all, you have to understand, I think you got to start with what are the objectives, what are the objectives for the state? And I'm not trying to not answer your question. I'm basically coming back to,
okay.
We would not advocate that type of a structure in an environment where you're trying to maximize the overall economic benefit. From the perspective of, if you truly want to build products that will enable you to really draw from what we would consider beyond the local populace to more regional, the casino resort model, where the machines are owned by the operators, the regulators' role is merely to govern and to provide oversight. We would always kind of tend to feel that that is the right structure from the perspective if you're trying to maximize the overall economic benefit of what you could potentially produce, whether it be gaming tax rates, whether it be jobs, whether all the indirect economic benefits, and other related taxes that these businesses pay. So, kind of in a vacuum, that's the way I would think about that. But again, if for example, some states have expressed more or less concern about what is the balance that they're targeting in terms of what percentage of the patronage do we want to come from locals, what percentage of the patronage do we want to come from what we'll call tourists. Tourists would be non-locals or out-of-state patronage, and what you build will have a direct relationship on that, because convenience gaming is ultimately what you end up with in a very high tax rate scenario where you're really just providing a product that is highly centralized to the area that's in closest proximity to that facility. General rule of thumb for that type of a product, 90% of the business, the volume, the gaming volume, 90 to 95% will come within an hour of the property. That holds true across, based on, and that's us looking at and evaluating well over 100, if not more, casino databases, so we know exactly where these facilities are situated and where their customers are coming from, and we can correlate that to the product, and ultimately, there are very clear correlations there. So again, I think it really just depends on what the ultimate goals are, and so does that answer your question? Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Baldwin. Appreciate you coming. We're going to go ahead and go to Ron Stevens, and he's going to go through House Bill 677.
Can you hear me now? House Bill 677 is in your folder. We've heard through two committees, Mr. Chairman, before we get started, and we've heard from people that basically would just like the Hope Scholarship just to go away, along with the gambling that pays for that. We've heard from people that really don't mind that we've got Hope Scholarship money leaving our state, as we've just heard, going to Florida, Alabama, and North Carolina. And the newest facility, of course, is basically you can spit right across the line from North Carolina into Georgia. And for those that, and I understand that and I get that. But I want to talk for just a minute before I go through the bill, since I'm Chairman of Economic Development in the House, to put just a little bit of perspective of what this really means economic development-wise, if that's okay, Mr. Chairman. We just, of course, all the papers just not very long ago talked about the Volvo project that went to South Carolina. It's a pretty big deal. Every newspaper, every newscast around the state over and over and over again talked about the Volvo project. And it was a big deal. Well, those were tax incentive about $130,000 per job that we paid to get those jobs. We heard in our first meeting that one of the projects was going to bring 10,000 jobs to the state of Georgia. Invest about $1 to $2 billion. To put that in perspective, that's Baxter and Caterpillar put together. Economic development to its fullest extent. But there's some of the things that none of these economic development projects do around the state, and I just wanted to just again put that in perspective. LOST, SPLOST, and ELOST, lower property taxes, SPLOST to build your capital projects, ELOST to build your schools. They pay those with each of these projects through this tourism destination. They also pay 4% sales tax to us, the state. On top of that, which none of these economic developments that are taxpayer incentivized, they pay a 7 to 8% hotel motel tax through part of their project. On top of that, according to the bill, they'll pay 12% gambling fee. 12% to fully fund the Hope Scholarship Program one more time. Oh, and on top of that, there's even more. Inside the bill, there's 2% of the fee that goes towards problem gambling to help fix that problem. But there's an incentive for your locals as well. And included in the bill is a 4% fee for locals to be able to use, because that's part of the bill as well. Everybody knows we've got a statewide referendum, a constitutional amendment. And then we've got to have a local referendum as well. So I bring this to you, Mr. Chairman, just to point out the phenomenal amount of economic development, irregardless of the Hope Scholarship, which is what all this is about. But just so that we can just keep that in perspective. And if you'll move along with me to the bill itself. The bill consists of 5 sections that amends our code and adds the establishment of the new, I'm sorry?
I didn't have it in my folder.
No bill in the folder?
No, it's not.
It's 150 pages, that's why it's not in the folder.
Oh, excuse me.
You can, it is online.
Okay, well then let me hit the highlights of the 150-page bill. Some of this, I might add, thank you, is I'd forgot that was a 150-page bill that I've got here. As I walk through the bill, trust me.
Those are the famous last words.
Thank you, Senator. The bill does consist of 5 sections. It amends the official code of Georgia and adds the new establishment of Georgia Lottery and Casino Gambling Commission and the Problem Gaming Fund. Pages 1 and 2 of the lines 1 through 37 has the introduction, which is the state's current state agency, the Georgia Lottery Commission. By marketing and entertaining products, the Georgia Lottery Corporation works to raise education fundings for pre-K program and the Hope Scholarship. This bill creates an addition to the Georgia Lottery Corporation, the Casino Gambling Commission. It establishes the provisions, terms, changes, prohibits certain conduct, and provides penalties related to the crimes and offenses that establishes in keeping a gambling place. In summary, following voter approval of a constitutional amendment in 2016, this bill would permit casino gambling in the state of Georgia with the main aim, and we've gotten off of that in these past couple of meetings, with the main aim at preserving the Hope Scholarship Program and other educational purposes. Casino gambling will only be allowed in those counties and municipalities that they themselves must approve by referendum. The establishment of licensed resort facilities. Such local referendum may not be held more than once every 3 years in the same county and municipality. So if they vote it down once in your area, can't come back for 3 years. A licensed resort facility will be subject to a 12% annual tax on their gross gaming revenues, but they would not be subject to the coin-operated amusement machine regulation taxation, which we already have in the state. Mr. Chairman, as I move forward, if you'll, well, since you don't have this large bill, let me just hit again the highlights of each section. On page 10, the Georgia Lottery and Casino Gaming Commission. The Lottery Commission is renamed in this bill the Georgia Lottery and Casino Gaming Commission. And it's vested with the regulation of casino gambling in this state. This commission is subject to open records and open meeting requirements, except it may determine where there's confidential information involved, and is not subject to the open records. The chairman of the commission's board must appoint a casino gambling advisory board made up of 10 members to advise the board in various aspects of the gaming industry and present the concerns of the casino gaming licenses, vendors, and other interested parties throughout the state. Among the duties of the commission shall be the jurisdiction to supervise and license these casino gambling in the state, the requirement to visit, investigate, and be given free access to the place of business of any licensee, to compel the production of any books, documents, records, memoranda of any of the licensees, promulgating rules and regulations to the casino gambling, including requirement of licensees post a sign bearing a phone number of the compulsive gambling assistance. And let me take just 1 second right here, Mr. Chairman, to recognize one of our own that's in the state of Georgia. And she's here with us today. Kim Ford is the Vice President of Public and Governmental Affairs with First Data Corporation. They're right here in Alpharetta, Georgia. 2,000 employees. Kim, are you here? Stand up just a little bit. The reason I bring them into this is they're the largest payer or processor of electronic payment system in the world. For your charge cards, it typically is going to go through First Data. Massive big deal. But the reason I bring them up is they're working on some products that basically can limit, for the problem gambler, the limits on what you can withdraw. It tracks where you go in some of these casinos. And you can sit down now, but I appreciate you coming, Kim. And track some of the gambling in the casinos so that we can help these problem gamblers. That's something we couldn't do a long time ago, and it's one of our own that's creating these particular products. They've already got one that has a debit card essentially online for online gamblers, so that you can't go over that amount. And I just wanted to recognize you for all the work that you've done to help this industry, and recognize one of our own. And thank you for the 2,000 employees too, by the way. And the other purposes are to inspect the premises where gambling devices are manufactured, sold, and distributed in the state, seizing equipment and supplies for examining the licenses of the resort facilities, to analyze the business of casino gaming and make the recommendations to the governor and the General Assembly regarding its regulation, analyze the scope of illegal gambling activities in the state, analyze problem gambling, as I just mentioned, auditing former licenses, issue subpoenas, compelling witnesses to attend, and only when the commission awards and issues gaming licenses may a person construct, establish, own, operate a facility in this state. I'm going to give to each and every one of you a summary of what each section of this does, but I'm going to go through just a few more of these pieces here. On page 15 of the bill creates 5 licensing regions throughout the state with a maximum of 6 casinos in the state to operate. Even in the absence of a license in any given region, the allotted licenses from each region cannot be increased. So this is the maximum in this state according to this bill. 6 total casinos, 5 regions. The commission can permit officers, directors, members, partners, and stockholders of the licensees, as well as other persons likely to have significant influence over the casino gaming operation of such licenses. Page 13 through 35 has to do with licensing. There is, of course, a cap of $500,000. The commission per license. If a casino goes and is denied a license for any reason, that is refunded. If that casino if that license is challenged, that permit fee is then forfeited to the commission, that deposit. Page 23 has the initial license and term. It is 15 years, subject to a 5-year review within the term. Licenses can file a notice of intent to renew the license 1 year before the expiration date. And again, with the size of the investment, that 15 years is a protection measure. Page 35 through 38 has to do with casino gambling for the education account. Casino gambling license fees, forfeited financial deposits. The funds are going to be held in the CGEA, and it may only be deposited up in the following purposes. And the governor's budget proposal for the General Assembly and the appropriations must follow the following guidelines. And they are: funding for education programs, 90% of the casino gambling proceeds dispensed to HOPE and other financial assistance pre-K educational shortfalls in their reserves. HOPE must be fully funded before allocating funds to any other purpose. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what all of these hearings were about. There is a maximum of 5% of the casino gamblings going for the payment of operation expenses with the regulation of casino gambling by the commission, and there is a maximum of 2% for going towards problem gambling. 4% can go to the financial support of counties and municipalities that host the licensed facility, and that's your local buy-in. That's over and above the loss plus and e-loss that they would typically get from these particular institutions. The Georgia Problem Gambling Fund is funded by 2% of the allotted fund coming from CGEA to award the grants of the state, entitles the organizations to provide programs for prevention and treatment of these problem gambling areas. Pages 43 through 50 has to do with criminal activity, and I will give you those, Mr. Chairman, in a highlighted form. And at this point, Mr. Chairman, as I have gone through the sections of the bill, since it is so long, I have hit, I think, every single piece of the bill as it stands today. I know there's conversations about the percentage fee changing, but as the bill stands today, 12% is the annual tax rate for these gaming operations. And I'll accept any questions.
Thank you, Chairman Stevens, and I apologize for my tardiness today. Sometimes my paying job gets in the way of public service. I will take questions from the committee right now. I have a couple of questions, and I went through the bill a little bit back when you introduced it, but haven't really looked at it much in detail since then. So the oversight, the regulation, the way it's going to be set up, it will be under the umbrella of the lottery and essentially build upon the existing lottery commission, which will be renamed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Will the process of how we constitute the lottery commission change any, or will it essentially use the same process we use now to appoint members to the commission?
It is. It's still appointed by the governor.
And that would be overseen by, or I guess they would be supported and advised by an advisory committee?
Yes.
Have you looked at, I've looked at this a little bit, I think it'd be something for over the next couple of weeks that we all want to take a look at, is states where there is a lottery and casinos, how many of them have it set up this way where it's integrated with the lottery from an oversight standpoint, and states where it may not be that way? I'd be curious how it's working there, and if it's, just see if we can divine some wisdom from what other states are doing from a regulatory standpoint.
I think that's worth worth looking at.
And this is kind of along those same lines. Is there any detail, I can't remember, on how the an RFP process would work? You prescribe the number of zones and the investment threshold in the bill, but how the process works in terms of who's awarded the license, is that spelled out in detail, or is that kind of left to the regulatory board?
As it should be, it's left to the regulatory board so that they're the ones that should have and will have the expertise.
Okay. And in terms of the number of licensing regions and zones, I've heard some chatter, some questions have been raised about the number of them. Is that something you'd be amenable to looking at as this process goes forward? I mean, do you think 6 is the right number, or would you be amenable to reducing the number of facilities, the number of zones, as we go through this process?
You know what? I hope in talking to some of the potential bidders for these licenses, they're looking for, of course, some protection to make sure that that we don't change our mind. And next week, after they've spent $1 to $2 billion on the facility, there's not one going to be popped up right next door. But yeah, that number can change as we move along if there's something that's has an overwhelming urge to do that. But and of course the map. People have seen the map that was on the in the bill. There's been some conversation that perhaps we use 2 of those facilities around the Atlanta area potentially, and then just use the 4 corners of our state to change the map. And that might be more receptive than changing the number.
Thank you. Is that Senator C?
It is.
Okay.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, would you help me understand the problem gambling fund, the 2% that you spoke of? Is that already in existence elsewhere, and how exactly does that work?
That fund is a 2% cap. That is actually, it's one of the glaring loopholes that we've got in our law now. We intend to fix it. What it creates is a maximum 2% fund to go in for the treatment. That again will be directed by the Lottery Commission and the Gaming Commission on how those funds or the grants are given out for the treatment of these problem gamblers.
Follow up.
Yes, ma'am.
Oftentimes when the gambler has a challenge, the families suffer. Is there any thought to families in terms of that grant process? I mean, if you're going through a treatment process, families oftentimes fall by the wayside. And that's a real concern for me, so I'm bringing it up on the front end because I want us to start thinking about not only the gambler, but, and that's why I was curious about other states, how they are handling it, and if, in fact, there have been any talk historically about the families that may, end up being in a crisis mode because of that.
And you bring up a very good point, which is, again, why I brought Kim here today, and in some of their innovative products that, quite honestly, weren't available 10 years ago. And the ability to put stop limits on a charge card that a family member may have, and what they can and can't get whenever they go to a particular facility. And that can be directed by the family, and it's and hopefully we've learned something from these other states, and quite honestly, none of these tourism destination facilities want to have this particular type of clientele there. I mean, they don't want to ruin somebody's future or their livelihood, quite honestly. So with some of these products that you're developing, I think we can head this off early.
Senator Sims, is that your light on?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we go back and revisit the sites and destinations statewide? I just want to make sure that Southwest Georgia is included. Only reason I'm here.
The lady brings a very good point. And I want to make sure that Southwest Georgia is included. And it's and the way the map is drawn now, in my personal opinion, we need to revisit it. Of course, all of the interest for the huge facilities, the conversation on the $1 to $2 billion investments, those are quite natural around where the population is in our state, and that's around the Atlanta donut. But the other opportunity for the other areas that the way the map is drawn, I personally think we need to change and just quarter up the other states for those other four areas. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Smyrie.
Mr. Chairman, in looking at the bill, when you started calculating the number of regions as it relates to the state, and follow up on the chairman and the senator's question, what was there a formula or any kind of calculations that were used to derive it? Say a primary and another one in Region 1, and then other licensures in the other parts of the state. How was that derived?
Good question. We had some conversations with the industry itself, and they seemed to think that the competitive issue with to maximize the amount of investment in our state, that number seemed to be appropriate, and also as you might imagine, by quartering up, and I'm suggesting that as an alternative to where we are. Some of the people, whenever they were in Savannah, weren't necessarily interested at all in some of the areas in Savannah, but they were interested in I-95. So if we quarter up the state, that gives them an opportunity on both ends.
Another question that I liked, I remember hearing a lot of the testimony, and a lot of the corporation that spoke of, and that was one of my points early on, as you recall, corporate social responsibility, being involved in the community, and so forth and so on. And in the bill, does the resort facility host community fund, does that correlate with that? Is that part of that? What's that community fund that's established in the bill?
That's as you might imagine, these facilities are going to draw an enormous amount of people. And that was the additional incentive placed in the bill so that there was additional buy-in by the locals.
Okay.
If there's, in fact, there's only a few issues that they can spend this money for, and we've already passed a transportation bill. But one of the within a 50-mile radius of this particular facility, you can improve infrastructure with transportation. As you might imagine, there's going to be a lot. Water and sewer is the local taxing authority can expand their water and sewer plant, and police and fire, of course, can be added onto with this local area, and some economic development projects within that local taxing district can be added as well. So if they're, in addition to SPLOST, they can use this money for an economic development project.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you.
Senator C.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's going to be my last question to you. I know that the map has 2 for the metro area, and I do want to say that representing Clayton County, and we are considered metro, that's a county that really could use that boost. So I want to make sure that, and I recognize we don't have the per capita income as some of the others that may be in there, but for the record, we do have the airport, and the city of Atlanta gets most of that. So we are looking for revenue streams to come south, and Clayton certainly. I'm hearing from both sides, and well, should it move forward, Clayton on the record.
If I may respond, Mr. Chairman, and Clayton County, of course, would be one of the 2 there. And keep in mind the airport being the busiest in the U.S. with 93 million people coming through the airport every year, and 10,000 jobs would be an enormous shot in the arm for Clayton County.
Yeah, we need the tram to run over there.
Chairman Maxwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was following up on Chairman Smyer's question about the Georgia Licensed Resort Facility Host Community Fund, I think it is. I was trying to see in here. I thought I'd read that was going to be 4%. Did I read that
Yes, sir.
somewhere? Now, that's an additional fund that's going to go into the state, and then they're going to have to apply back to the state to get that for the transportation and the infrastructure and all the issues. But that would be in addition to their local eSPLOST, the regular sales tax, and all the other taxes they'll get in their local community. Is that correct?
That is correct. Even if they had an eSPLOST that builds schools, this can be, that's one of the provisions in this bill, that if this particular host community adopts this, then on top of everything else, this 4% can build schools, add some of the other named.
So if we're looking at an initial tax rate of 12 and then another 4 on top of the 12,
No, that's built into that comes out of the gaming proceeds. It's not another tax. It's pulled off the top from the gaming proceeds.
Explain to me what the difference is between that and the tax. I have a little problem with that.
We're asking that there be a 12, in addition to everything else that we do, we're asking that there be a separate 12% gaming tax that fully funds HOPE.
But this 4% is going to come out of their proceeds
Right.
too, but that's not a tax.
No, that comes out of the 12% tax that.
Oh, that comes out of the 12%.
Right.
Okay, well, so 12 is not going into HOPE then.
$239 million is the number that we got that fully funds HOPE. But
That's for this year maybe, but that we know that won't continue on.
part of the revenues that are coming out of that does not go, that comes off the top, is going to be for problem gambling, 2% maximum.
Okay, so that's all coming out of the 12%.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt you, but all right, we may need to relook at some of those numbers then. All right, that's what I was trying to figure out, what our effective tax rate was going to be if this was additional or coming out of that 12%.
It comes out of 12%.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a follow-up on the 12% tax, there's been some talk about whether or not that's the appropriate amount, whether or not we actually could go higher. We've heard, I think, in Savannah, someone suggested around 20% may be more appropriate. Are you open to a higher rate, or do you think 12% is what we need to stick with?
That's what we put in the bill, is the number that seemed to fit for the maximum amount of investment for economic development wise. If we're looking for a $2 billion tourism destination product, then that number seems to fit. But the mistake I think some of the states made is in New York, that carries like a 50% tax rate, and of course you don't get the reinvestment back into the facilities to keep it looking fresh and to keep people coming. So somewhere I believe between 12 and 25% is the correct number, and we all need to decide what that number is going to be.
Thank you.
I don't see any further questions. Thank you, Chairman Stevens.
Thank you, Kim, too, also for coming.
Next on the agenda, we've got Senator Beach, but I believe we had a witness that had some travel restrictions and needed to go kind of early in the day. Professor Walker, are you here, Professor? You needed to kind of go in the morning, didn't you? Okay, we'll go ahead and put you in, and then we'll slide Senator Beach in after you. And Professor Walker is a professor of economics at College of Charleston. You can give us a little bit about your background, and or you can, and then just go right into your presentation.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and for all the chairs and the committee members for listening to me. My name is Doug Walker. I'm a professor of economics at the College of Charleston. Prior to that, I've been there since 2007, but prior to that I was a professor at Georgia College in Milledgeville for 9 years. And so I'm somewhat familiar with the Hope Scholarship and students who are beneficiaries of that. My primary research during my career has been on the casino industry and gambling and policies related to those things. I've published 2 books on the issue and more than 50 journal articles and book chapters. So it's the economic and social impacts of casino gambling has been my primary focus. So aside from academic research, I occasionally do consulting work. I've done some for a variety of states, including Florida and Maryland, and also Kansas, which Rich from Union earlier, we actually worked together on a project there. My interest in Georgia was that, well, first of all, I was a resident and a taxpayer here and a state employee for 9 years. And the introduction of casinos would change the Southeast market pretty dramatically, and also probably affect the politics of gambling in South Carolina, where I am, where there really isn't any interest, I don't think, in commercial casinos or even tribal casinos. The governor has said that she's not interested in having a tribal casino right on the border near Charlotte, and that tribe is now looking to go to North Carolina. So we're probably not going to have casinos in in South Carolina. But I think the other thing is that I'm 2 hours from Savannah, and I've been to Savannah. I like Savannah, so I went down for the hearing that you had there last month, and I heard some of the speakers who talked about the economic and social impacts of casinos, stuff that I've been studying for 15, 20 years, and heard some very interesting statements about what the likely impacts would be. So I thought, I was a state employee for 9 years. I've seen the students that have come through Georgia College. I've taught about 2,000 of them. And so when I hear information that I think is not really objective or good, I thought it would be somewhat useful for me to come and try to give you kind of a academic perspective on economic and social impacts. So that's what I'm going to do today. Well, it should be said, first of all, that, and by the way, for the audience, there's huge pillars here. So I'm going to try, I had planned on talking, assuming everyone could see the slides, but I'm going to try to talk assuming no one can see the slides, so that hopefully you guys in the audience can understand a little bit more of what I'm saying here without seeing it. So everyone has a perspective or a bias on this, and it's no different for economists. How economists view transactions in a market is just that people spend their money in ways that they expect to benefit as a result. So if I buy a new car, it's because I expect to benefit, and the car is going to give me more value than I pay. The same is true if I want to spend my money on lottery tickets or at a casino. I do that because I expect to benefit. Generally, it's going to be for entertainment purposes. And gambling is just putting money at risk for some positive outcome, but there's some uncertainty involved. Some people enjoy that, some people don't. But since the expected value of all gambling products, lottery tickets or casino games, is negative, you have to assume that the people that are spending their money that way expect to benefit. They enjoy it. Psychologists probably view gambling a different way. And most of the research on gambling is by psychologists, and they're focused on problem gambling. And so their perspective is more likely to be a concern with minimizing the harms that come as a result of gambling and from problem gambling. So I'll talk about that a little bit. So disordered gambling, or pathological gambling, the term for this changes through time. But the research in psychology suggests that it's roughly 1% of the population. There's a range, and it does change in different jurisdictions, but generally it's been around 1% of the adult population is thought to have a gambling problem. This isn't rational behavior. It's people that are out of control. They might put their entire life savings at risk. They might lose their house. As the senator mentioned, they often affect their families in very negative ways. And it's something that the industry and you as policymakers, of course, want to be dealing with as you contemplate should you have casinos. Social costs that were talked about in your Savannah meeting are usually attributed to problem gamblers, and I'll talk about that more later. But the main reason for government to be involved and to highly regulate the industry is often the view that, okay, this is a vice and it's something that there's a potential for addiction, and so we should be careful with how we proceed with it. Now, in terms of the economic benefits, those are some of the things that you all are probably very well familiar with and have talked a lot about. Some of those are pretty easily measurable. They include tax revenues, employment and wages, and potentially economic growth and development. But there's other benefits that come from allowing casinos to exist, and one has to do with the consumers. And I mentioned that earlier, that as an economist, I view it as, it's a mutually beneficial transaction. And so consumers who like to gamble, who like to go play casino games, they benefit also. There's more entertainment options for them. In terms of tourist destinations, there's another option that someone might want to choose Atlanta or Savannah over some other destination if they like gambling. So it provides more competition in the entertainment industry, which is usually associated with lower prices, higher quality. But you also have to consider the counterfactual, and that is if casinos are not introduced, what other industry might have expanded? And this is a little bit abstract, but that's the true benefit of introducing casinos, is the difference between what would happen if they were here versus what would have otherwise happened. And of course, no one really knows what would have otherwise happened, so that's a difficult thing to estimate. Tax revenues you were just discussing with respect to the bill. Economists see those technically as a transfer of wealth, but of course in this case what you're trying to do is bring in revenues to help shore up the Hope Scholarship. And that's the main reason, tax revenues is the main reason most states look at legalization in the first place. So on the slide there I have a variety of rates which range from about 6% to over 60%. On GGR, that's gross gaming revenue. That's the 12% that Representative Stevens was mentioning. And those really vary across the country. But on top of those, casinos usually pay state income taxes also. And I do agree with what Rich from Union said. I think there's a general agreement that the lower tax rates are likely to encourage a larger capital investment. And if you look at it from a corporation's view, if they have the opportunity to invest in a variety of different states, they're going to choose the options that look to them to be most profitable. And lower tax rates are going to be more attractive to them for obvious reasons. But it's not obvious that tax revenues will always increase with the introduction or expansion of gambling. There was one study in 2011, which I was a co-author of, where we, looking at all states over time, didn't find a significant positive impact on overall state revenues. But when you consider tourism and economic growth effects and subsequent income tax effects, then I think you do see at least a modestly positive effect on revenues considering all states. And since gross gaming revenues are always taxed, 25-30% is probably the average across the country. That's much higher than the average sales tax rate. So even if people divert all the spending that comes into a casino from other sources, you know that your tax revenue is going to be higher as a result, since the tax on casinos is probably the highest of anything that's taxed in the state. And it's similar usually to lottery taxes, the rate is. One of the issues that comes up when people are talking about the revenues is the casino market becoming saturated? Are there too many? This is particularly a concern in the Northeast, where last year 4 of 12 casinos closed. And so the question comes up frequently, are there too many casinos now in the U.S.? You might ask, should a particular state even care if the region is saturated? Because what they're concerned with is potentially keeping their own people spending within the state as opposed to going outside of the state. But the best measure, I think, of whether this is an issue or not, whether saturation is an issue, is do casino companies want to come and build there? If they do, they think they can make a profit on it, so they must think that the industry is not oversaturated in that region if they're willing to come here. I think one thing that's clear from this issue of saturation, though, if you look at the Northeast, where you have Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun, which are huge properties and have seen declining sales, is that both the industry and the regulators need to think about how is the future likely to be in terms of casino development in the region. Right now, I would say, well, Alabama is not likely to have commercial casinos, neither is South Carolina, and maybe neither is Florida, but that could change, and you need to consider that. So this is a slide of, which probably most people can't see or read, but it shows casino revenues in Northeast states, and it shows in 2006, once Pennsylvania legalized casinos and added table games, revenues in Atlantic City dropped dramatically, and Pennsylvania kind of picked up the slack there. A few other states have added since, but this is the area where people are most concerned about market saturation. Taxes paid by casinos in Northeast states have gone up primarily from Pennsylvania, where they have a 55% rate on gross gaming revenues. That's on average, I think, one of the highest in the country. And they're, I think, the second highest in terms of revenue, even just behind Nevada to the state. But in the Southeast, you still don't have this type of development. You have a few small casinos in North Carolina, a few tribal casinos in Alabama, and then some in Florida. This is a map of the Northeast where you can see how it's really developed quite a bit. Massachusetts is just adding casinos. But the only thing that used to be there was Atlantic City and the two in Connecticut. But now there's casinos pretty convenient to everyone. And New Hampshire is actually going through the same process. You all are here now trying to figure out, should we add a casino or not? And for New Hampshire, it's, we're real close to Massachusetts. All our people are going to be going there. Should we have a casino here? So in terms of the politics and taxes, I just wanted to mention that overall, for most states, casino taxes represent a relatively small amount of their revenues. Less than 5% in most states, but it can make a difference, and it can make a difference for particular programs, or it can help to avoid having to raise other taxes or cut spending. And one of the primary motivations is the idea of what they call in the literature defensive legalization. Why not keep the people home spending their money? If they're going to be spending money at casinos anyway, why not allow them to do it here? The regressivity question comes into play a lot. Mainly with lotteries, the idea of regressivity is that people with lower incomes pay a higher proportion of their incomes in purchasing the product. And so there's pretty good evidence that the lottery is regressive in the sense that poor people spend more on lottery tickets than wealthier people do. The same issue has not been shown in any literature with respect to casinos, and it's kind of a complicated argument, but it's unclear whether the tax is actually passed on to the casino players or not. It's an issue that I'm actually studying now, but that's not an issue that usually comes up in the debate with casinos as it did with lotteries. Now, in terms of the employment effect, that's been studied quite a bit in economics from casinos, and the concern is, will they create new jobs, or will they just redistribute jobs or cannibalize jobs from other industries? The best study I think that's been done on this was a county-level analysis for all U.S. counties, which showed that there were in counties that had casinos compared to those that didn't, there's modest positive employment impacts, and those are primarily in entertainment and hospitality sectors, which should not be too surprising. And there's also minor wage effects, but those tend to be statistically insignificant. The effect of a casino is going to be greater in a smaller county population, simply because it's going to represent a larger component of the overall economy compared to a larger city, for example. Economic growth, there's some evidence that casinos have contributed to economic growth at a state level, and you can see that why it would be obviously the case in places like Las Vegas, Macau, or the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And the intuition behind that is that it's simply increased economic activity, and that is what causes economic growth. The consumer benefits I mentioned before, and I won't go into too much more detail about those, but that's usually ignored in the debate. But the consumers, the people who enjoy the activity, benefit. I live in Charleston, where we have a bunch of wonderful restaurants, and when another restaurant opens, I benefit from that. There's more options, the restaurants have to compete with each other more, and prices end up falling eventually. And so that's what makes Charleston a great city that people want to visit. They have lots of things to do, lots of good restaurants. Entertainment isn't tangible, but it's something that's valuable to consumers nevertheless. Buying tickets to baseball games, that's a benefit. All right, on to the economic costs. So this idea of industry cannibalization, you can kind of get at that with the jobs issues that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. There is some evidence that the casino industry is a substitute for the lottery, but it's a very small effect. I would estimate about a 2% to 3% effect. I did a study along with Will Cummings for the Maryland lottery, where we looked at what has happened to their lottery as casinos were introduced, and we looked at zip code level sales data of lottery tickets and compared the distance to the casino and found a small negative impact on the lottery. But when you combine the revenues from the lottery and the casinos, the overall impact is very positive in terms of state revenues. There's not a lot that's been studied in terms of relationships between the casino industry and other non-gambling industries, but if you look at number of firms at the county level, where there's casinos, there end up being more firms opening as opposed to closing compared to non-casino counties. So that leads me to believe that there's in general, a positive economic effect from the industry. There are often infrastructure requirements that casinos, they create traffic, they need some improvements in terms of roads and utilities, but typically in legislation, the casinos pay for a lot of those costs. So when you look at the net just economic impacts of those things I've mentioned, I think that and you look at the studies that have been done, it's hard to argue that the purely economic effects aren't positive. I'd say it's more positive than negative. Now, when you consider the social costs, that's another important issue on the cost side of the market. I mentioned those are attributed mostly to pathological gamblers. Some of the types of costs, those people miss work more often. They may be less productive at work. They may be more likely to engage in crime. Corruption of public officials is thought to happen, and it shouldn't be under pathological gamblers. It's not that those people are going to corrupt public officials, but that the process of legalizing may. Divorce, bankruptcy, and these types of things. The family issues that the senator had asked about before. So this is a real problem for these people. These costs have, in the 1990s, there were attempts to measure in monetary terms these costs, and an average estimate would be around $10,000. And in your Savannah meeting, one of the speakers suggested that the cost-benefit ratio is 3 to 1. Well, that number has been mentioned a lot, and it comes from a book by Earl Grinnells, but is based on almost completely arbitrary estimates. And so to think that that is like some good estimate of the cost-benefit ratio, I think is misguided. But policymakers need data to make decisions. One of the big problems with understanding the issue of problem gambling is that most of those people have other problems also. Psychologists who studied this have found that roughly 75% of the people that have gambling problems also have alcohol problems. Around 40% may have drug problems. And so it becomes very difficult to attribute a social cost estimate, whether it's $10,000 or some other number, just to the gambling problem. There's no way of accurately or objectively allocating the costs across the different problems the person may have. And so that's one of the main issues with social cost estimates. Sure, they exist, but it's difficult to put a dollar value on it. And I've spent way too much time looking into that literature and understanding it, but that's the fundamental point. Trying to put a dollar value on it's very difficult. And then casinos and crime, that's one of the main concerns that comes up when there's a discussion of introducing casinos. I do think it's true that problem gamblers are more likely to engage in crime. I've done a study that showed that. Casinos may be seen as like the ideal place for crimes to be committed. There's a bunch of cash there. Why not, if I'm a criminal, go to the casino where there's a bunch of cash? That seems to be a potentially good place to go. So there's been probably 20 or 30 studies over the past couple decades that have looked at this. A lot of them have been in Atlantic City or other more established markets, but there's no convincing evidence or no overwhelming evidence that there is a link between casinos and crime. In fact, the studies, what they show is it depends on how you treat the visitors. If you don't include tourists in your measure of the population, then the data suggests that casinos will cause more crime. But if you include the tourists in the crime rate as potential victims, then there is no relationship between casinos and crime. So the studies are really, it's very interesting to have the studies come out. It almost always depends on how they've dealt with visitors in their study. So there's a bunch of other concerns which I, as an economist, do not address because they're not economics issues, but they're nevertheless very important potentially for your consideration as you think about should casinos be legalized here. Citizens, of course, may not like the idea that the state is condoning gambling and is enabling the industry to exist. There's NIMBY concerns. People may not want to live around a casino. There may be concerns, moral concerns about gambling, and should the state be condoning it. Well, you already have the lottery here, so to me it's, I don't see any fundamental difference between buying lottery tickets and playing blackjack, so I don't know how big of an issue that is here. The beer over 5% alcohol doesn't really fit in here, but when I was in Milledgeville, I remember I couldn't get beer that had more than 5% alcohol, but I could buy vodka. I never understood why that is. So I was trying to put a relationship between the lottery and casinos. What's the fundamental difference? But that's an issue that some people will have. And then also, you know, what's the role of government? How should people be free to spend their money the way they want to? Those are issues that you may need to consider, but that are difficult to put into monetary terms or to analyze economically. But these issues rarely come up in debates over casinos. So to summarize the research, the economic benefits are relatively easy to measure. They're the things that are focused most on employment, wages, and tax revenues. It's difficult to measure consumer benefits, and so it's often ignored in the debate. I would argue it's probably the biggest actual economic benefit because those people enjoy the activity, those people that decide to gamble. And then the economics costs, like industry cannibalization, job losses in other industries, those are more difficult but still measurable. And the social cost issues are extremely difficult to measure. And so I would argue that research should focus on what are the types of harms and their prevalence rates, how often do they occur, and not be focused so much on the dollar values of social costs, because 3-to-1 ratios, that's completely arbitrary. So you have to kind of say, well, how big of an issue are these? Does the 2% funding for problem gambling, what are the issues that you want to address with that? I think that's a good approach to look at. We want to try to deal with these particular problems and not try to get to some overall cost-benefit number would be my advice on that. Anyway, there's my contact information. I have this book called Casinonomics, which I'm sure a few people would want to read. It's pretty academic, but it discusses a lot of these issues. But if you have any questions or comments for me, I'd be happy to take them, or you can email me also, but I'm happy to take questions right now.
Thank you, Professor. Chairman Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got two questions. In one of your slides, I see here in the Reno study shows that areas near casinos are safer.
Yes, and I skipped that. I was trying to not be here all day, making you guys listen to me all day, but since you're asking. Yeah, so there was a criminologist at University of Nevada, Reno that studied, and it's a little bit outside of economics, but it's one of these studies where they've looked at where the crimes were reported in proximity to the downtown, which is where all the casinos are, and also the times at which the crimes were reported. And they found that the vast majority of crimes, at least in Reno, are concentrated in one little area, and that around the casino is actually safer, and which makes some intuitive sense. The industry, the casinos don't want everyone leaving the casino and then getting robbed. So they have an incentive for their own private security to be pretty good there. But it was interesting because this is one of the 2 or 3 only studies that look at where do the crimes take place. And in Reno, they don't happen near the casino, which I think is an interesting finding.
Wow. And as a follow-up, you mentioned that and of course, a big concern of all of us is to make sure that we protect the our lottery. And did you say that the effect of casinos is negligible on the cannibalization of that lottery?
Yeah, if you look at a general state level study, you'll find there is a negative impact between lotteries and casinos, but it's 2 to 3% is my guess, and this is based on Maryland, the Maryland study that we did. Now, I would consider that negligible. That's a matter of opinion, but the overall revenue, if you were to add casinos, when you add casino tax revenue and lottery revenue, is going to go up dramatically. So it's a 2% difference, or 2-3%. That's not a big difference. Now, I think the argument here is that fundamentally these are different games. Casino games are typically more of a social thing, in many cases table games, whereas the lottery is something that, if you're buying Powerball tickets, you're waiting 3 or 4 days to get the results. So I think it's the case that these are largely different products. Now, in Maryland, some of your questions or your discussion earlier was looking at should the lottery also regulate the casinos, and I think in Maryland they do have that model where both are under the same regulatory agency. And that's what they were wondering, is to what extent is our casinos, other casinos, affecting our lottery revenues?
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Representative Smyrie.
I have one, Mr. Chairman. What struck me, because I had looked at your presentation earlier, and you might not have drilled as far, but on the revenue versus taxes, it just what drew me off was the New Jersey was the highest in revenues, but yet it's almost one of the lowest in taxes paid, and Pennsylvania was medium-sized revenues, and it's the highest taxes paid. Anything behind that doing your research?
Well, the New Jersey tax rate is about 6%.
Mm-hmm.
The industry has fallen from something like 12. Let's see. Yeah, it was $5 billion, and it's fallen something like 40%. So the New Jersey revenues have been really high, but the tax rate's been really low. So they've got a 6% tax rate. Pennsylvania is at like 55% on machines. So that's why Pennsylvania is now in the Northeast at least, the largest, they get the largest tax revenues.
Yeah, 1.4 billion.
Yeah, so it's just a difference between the rate. And the industry in Pennsylvania is still, it's gone up quite a bit, and it's because, for people in Philadelphia, why bother driving to Atlantic City now?
Gotcha.
You can do the same.
Representative Dollar.
Thank you. I'm not actually a member of the committee, so I appreciate the chairman obliging me here. I'd ask a quick question. In one of the earlier slides, by a 2011 study, that you saw a slightly negative impact on state tax revenues. That sounds a little counterintuitive. Can you just touch on that?
It is, and I was one of the authors of that study, so it was very surprising. So what we were looking at is every state over a period, I think it was 1990 to 2005, maybe, that period, looking at overall state revenues net of federal transfers, and looked at what happened as a result of different types of gambling. Now, what we found we had two different variables. One was, does a casino exist, and then how much of the revenue is there. And when you look at that across all states across all these years, the overall effect was found to be slightly negative. Now, that doesn't mean there's all negative effects in every state. There's some that are positive, some that are negative. But the way this model was set up, it accounted for tourism and economic growth separately from that. And so what I'm arguing here is that when you include the tourism effects and the economic growth effects, which from the model were positive, the sum of all of those three put together is positive. Okay, so now there's some states where the industry is very small. South Dakota is very small. There's other states where it's very large. And so when you aggregate all of these together, you're not going to see much of an effect anyway. So you probably don't want me to go into too much detail about the model, but it was surprising that it wasn't just unambiguously positive for every state.
So on from the if I'm hearing you right, from the gaming perspective, you taking out the tourism and those economic drivers, it's a wash essentially.
I would feel okay stating it that way.
Okay,
yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Senator Cowser.
In your studies, have you noticed whether every state tends to have dedicated revenues, such as this proposal, to go to the HOPE versus just putting it into the general fund and letting the legislature prioritize where the money is most needed?
I think it varies. There's some that it's for general. I think Pennsylvania dedicates it to like some veterans and maybe retirement type programs. There's some that give some to the general, so it's really all across the board. I think politically it's probably more successful when it's tied to some particular program, even though, as you all may know, just because you say we're going to put this money into that, earmarked it for that, that doesn't mean you can't reduce funding elsewhere. So I think it's all over the board, really. But I think politically it's usually more successful probably when it's is aimed at one particular program.
By that you mean it's more likely to pass gambling if you pick such
well, I think
source?
so. I mean, and the Hope Scholarship's a great example of that. That's what South Carolina followed that model, and if it's connected to a good cause, that revenue wouldn't have otherwise existed. I think voters see it more as, yes, we care about this issue and we're willing to do this for that.
Thanks.
I don't have any other questions. Any other lights on? We've got your contact information. I appreciate your willingness to answer any questions we have subsequent to this, and thank you for your time today.
And you all have, I have copies of the slides, but I think you all have those.
I think we do. We do. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to go back in order on the agenda again. Senator Beach is going to provide an overview of a proposal that he's been working on pertaining to horse racing and pari-mutuel wagering. Senator Beach.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Michael's going to hand out a copy of the bill, a copy of the presentation, and something we found on internet horse racing going on in Georgia, just for your information. I also want to introduce Dean Reeves and Carl Buchart. They're co-presidents of the Horse Racing Coalition. Thank you for all your hard work on that. And then Kat's going to work the presentation, and I'll just present from here. Basically, Senate Resolution 135 was a constitutional amendment. It was only a page and a half, and it basically just was going to ask the voters to vote on whether they wanted to allow for pari-mutuel wagering on horse racing, and the funds would go to the Hope Scholarship through the Lottery Corporation. Just to give you a little brief history, we came up short on votes last year. It's actually still in regulated industries. Got out of regulated industries, but we didn't have the votes, so it now has gone back to regulated industries committee. And partly because I made a mistake and I didn't have the enabling legislation, because I had some senators tell me the devil's in the details and we want to see the details. So what I'm going to go over with you today is the enabling legislation that we just got. Matter of fact, doesn't even have a bill number yet because it's not going to be ready till 3 o'clock, but this is the electronic version and the LC number on this, the bill that I'll pick up today at 3 o'clock. But before I go over the enabling legislation, I'd just like to touch on the equestrian industry, what impact it'll have on Georgia, and to tell you that this is really about economic development. When you look at the jobs, the 6,000 direct and indirect jobs that horse racing will bring from breeding, farming, hospitality, tourism, and I would even add and push for auctions, I think that's going to be a key element in the future for the horse racing industry. The other thing I would point out to you is this is privately financed, no taxpayer dollars for a world-class facility. I would not even carry this bill if it had taxpayer money tied to it, but it is all privately financed. $25 million towards education. 87% of the wagering comes from out of state, and the polling shows that 72% of Georgians are in favor of putting this on the ballot. We have 180,000 horses right now in the state of Georgia, and I think we can build upon that and create an ecosystem that will establish and grow the equine industry. More horses. This is an interesting fact. We have more horses today than we did in the Civil War in the state of Georgia. So let me be clear again, this is economic development. It's bringing the equestrian industry to Georgia and doing so with all private investment and no tax dollars. So now, does everybody have a copy of the presentation? We'll start with this PowerPoint presentation. It's 12 pages, and I'll go through it real quick, and then we will answer any questions you have. Basically, what we would do is establish a division of horse racing. The legislation creates the division of horse racing under the Georgia Lottery Corporation. The board of the Georgia Lottery Corporation will appoint a director of the division of horse racing. This individual will have to have 10 years experience in the horse industry, and there's some qualifications and criteria that he has to have in the job description, and it is in the bill. The division of horse racing is funded entirely by permit fees paid by individuals and entities involved in horse racing, and all monies received by the division of horse racing are placed in a state operations fund. If you go to the next page, Cap, thank you. The duties of the division of horse racing, and you can just see these, are maintain jurisdiction and supervision of all horse racing license under this provision, establish and enforce all rules and regulations, audit and report to the governor and to the General Assembly annually, appoint stewards, veterinarians, inspectors, and other employees essential to the operation of the horse racing track, fingerprint and conduct background checks on all employees and licensees, issue all licensees, and grant permits for non-thoroughbred racing at its discretion. Next page. It'll be a maximum of 3 licenses, and if you look, they must pass a background check. They identify all their stockholders, be adequately capitalized, and they must demonstrate a successful history of operating not less than 5 racetracks, managing a handle of at least $2 billion a year over a 5-year period. And that way we will have people that know what they're doing in this industry and have the qualifications to do this. This is all on page 15 in the bill. But if you look at subsections 11, 15, and 17, that outlines the provisions for denying a licensee to any individual or entity. Subsection 19 sets the time frame for a racetrack's license. And then subsection 20 regulates the licensing process for advanced deposit wagering. And what this is, it's a method of parimutuel wagering conducted in this state is permissible under the Federal Interstate Horse Racing Act of 1978, in which an individual may establish an account with an entity licensed by the division to place parimutuel wagers in person or electronically. And they will be have a 5-year license and be reviewed annually. Application and permits, the next page. Requirements for applications, consideration of applications, duties and responsibilities of the Division of Horse Racing in issuing license, time frames for notification and responses, and penalties for suspension or revocation of licenses. This is all outlined through 21 through 27. Next slide talks about satellite facilities. We would have no more than 15 satellite locations. No facility can be located in a county or municipality without the approval of the voters via local referendum. So if the constitutional amendment were to pass, then this would have to also pass by the locals to see if they wanted to have a racetrack or a satellite in their location, in their county. Only 3 racetrack licenses will be issued, and in fact, any at one time. Handle, next page. Handle means the total amount of all parimutuel wagering from all sources, from out of state, from everywhere. It goes into a pool, and it's the handle. The takeout means the percentage of the handle deducted by the track prior to distribution to the bettors. And if you look at the next page, we look at this distribution of the takeout. The distribution of the takeout is 5% to be used for purses on the live racing at the track, 3% to be allocated to the Hope Scholarship and Needs-Based Scholarship, 1% to the local governing authority of the racetrack or satellite facility within its jurisdiction, 0.5% to breeder awards as incentives to grow the equine industry in Georgia. And I got to tell you, I think that's one of the most important things. And what I've been told is that's one of the reasons Alabama failed, is they really didn't address the breeding portion of horse racing. And that can be a big part of our ecosystem in our industry. 0.1% to the UGA School of Veterinary Medicine. The balance will go to cover the racetrack and satellite facilities operating the expenses. Next page is looks at the fees, the annual fees. A racetrack will pay a $150,000 fee every year to maintain the license. Advanced deposit wagering, $150,000. Satellite fees will be $15,000. Non-thoroughbred racing facilities, $15,000, and then so on. Associated businesses, $5,000. Employees and owners and trainers, $500 and $100. So these are not to exceed amounts, and they will be reviewed annually by the Division of Horse Racing. Interstate Compact on licensure. The purpose of this compact is to establish uniform licensing requirements amongst the participating states and to authorize the Division of Horse Racing to participate in this compact. Lines 40-43 outline their duties. It's on page 26. The purpose, the definitions, the powers and duties, the voting requirements, and the administration of the compact. Next, subsection 50 through 58 outlines the penalties and fines associated with various criminal acts conducted in association with racetrack operations and/or pari-mutuel wagering. And then finally, the effective date. The act would be effective January 1, 2017. The amendment to the Constitution must first be passed by the General Assembly, 2/3 in each, the House and Senate, and then be ratified by the electors in November 2016 on the ballot. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will answer any questions.
So the satellites, so there would conceivably be 3 tracks and 15 locations around the state where bets could be accepted on the races at Georgia tracks, and assuming races worldwide for that matter.
Correct. Yeah. The racing comes in, as I said, 87% of the racing wagering comes from out of state. So the satellite units they may be running races from Saratoga or Churchill Downs or whatnot, and they could place bets there.
Okay. Do we have any questions? Chairman Stevens.
Is there a provision of the local referendum that prohibits a vote in a specific time period, like we've got in the other bill, that's no more than every 3 years? So, for example, if they vote it down 1 year, you've got to wait a 3-year period before it can come up, and would that be appropriate?
I don't think we addressed that. But we can look at that because we did not address that. It was a one-time vote, but we will look at that.
Thank you.
Senator Calsert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you support this legislation, Senator, if it did not have the off-track component? If we only had on-site gambling at the racetracks?
I think the off-track component is very important, and for the whole ecosystem of what we're trying to do in the equestrian industry. So now we can maybe change it from 15 to a different number, but I do think you have to have some satellite facilities, and these are nice facilities, Mr. Cowser. These are nice facilities. They have to. There's certain square footages and certain amount of food and so on that has to be served. It's in the enabling legislation.
In that regard, do the same people that own we'll call them live facilities, also own the off-track?
No.
Things? Different people?
It's different people. And to the point of the restrictions on the satellite facilities, the square footage and so on, so you're not going to see these at a Chevron station where people would be doing this. It's going to be very controlled. You got to have a license, and it's got to be voted on by the county that they want to put one in.
Okay, thank you.
I see no further questions. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, next we have Representative Evans. You just want to do it from your seat down there, or you want to?
There's a handout coming around, but I hope that really that's more homework and take-home reading, if you will. I want to just share some information that my office has gathered about where we are currently in higher education and higher education funding and where we need to be. And so I'm going to end up throwing a lot of numbers at you, and if you're anything like me, you can only absorb so many numbers at once, and so this is really more to have later. But I hope that it will be helpful. And I just want to say I do appreciate the opportunity to address the committee and share this information with you, and I hope that it'll be helpful for you, and I hope that you'll follow up with me later if you have any other questions or want any other information, because chances are we have, if you're looking for a certain set of numbers, the chances are we have them or have them close by, and would be happy to share them with you. But this whole study committee, you know, we're here to talk about how do we maintain and how do we expand potentially HOPE and tuition assistance for students who are trying to access higher education. And so we're not, and part of the, and one of the ways we're talking about doing that is potentially having casino gambling or having parametrial wagering, but we're not talking about having these industries for the sake of having these industries. And at the same time, we're not talking about providing financial assistance just for the sake of providing financial assistance. Why do we do that? We don't do it necessarily just to help students. That's nice, and I think I certainly appreciated it as a young student who was the first in my family to go to college. Without that financial assistance, I wouldn't be there, and I very well might not be sitting in front of you today. So we want to help people, but at the end of the day, another reason and a large reason that we want to do this as a state, and we say maybe we want to spend these resources here, is because we want to build our workforce to where it needs to be, and we know that we need an educated workforce, and so we need to provide the resources and incent people to go on and pursue higher education. So with that in mind, what we know according to Complete College Georgia is that by 2020, 60% of the jobs in Georgia will require some sort of higher education certificate or degree, associate's degree, bachelor's degree. So we need 60% of our adults to have some sort of higher education degree. We know as a subset of that 60% that about 70% of those need to be in some technical field, vocational and technical training like you might get at a technical college. But I just want to focus on that 60% number for a minute. So that's what we need by 2020. So how are we doing right now? Approximately 36% of Georgians right now have some higher education degree of some kind, associate's degree or higher. So you see there's a gap there. So how do we fill that gap? Who's currently seeking higher education? Right now, if you just look at the income levels of folks that are entering higher education, 82% of students from incomes in the top 25%. So we're talking about income levels, top 25% quartile. 82% of those students are entering into some form of higher education, and 71% of them are graduating. So we're doing a pretty good job in the upper quartile, and that's not surprising. We can all figure out why that's happening. Now, when you look at the bottom 25% of income earners, only 45% of students are entering into some form of higher education, and only 8% of those students are graduating. That's staggering. 45% entering in the first place, less than half. 8% of those 45% actually making across the graduation stage and earning that certificate or degree that we need them to get to be part of our 60% of our educated workforce. So that's where we have the opportunity to grow our higher education population. And that, I think, if anyone's listened to Chancellor Huckabee lately, he'll tell you, if we're going to get to that workforce number that we need, the educated workforce that we need, we've got to expand and broaden the population of students that are seeking higher education. So since we can see that there's a correlation between access to money and pursuing higher education, we know that we can increase the number of those students without access to that income or those funds by providing more financial tuition assistance. And so that's why I'm here today. We're not just talking about casinos for the sake of casinos, and we're not talking about financial assistance for the sake of financial assistance. We're trying to fill a need. And so I think this allows us to be very deliberate about how we get to that 60% number. So those students who are in that bottom quartile and aren't currently seeking higher education at a level that we need them to, how are we going to get them there? Some people might say, well, why don't you just work? I worked when I did a part-time job, but I mean, some folks that are a little bit older than me perhaps might say, well, I worked and paid my way through and I didn't have any debt. Well, one of the handouts that I have for you is, it's called The Myth of Working to Pay for College. And a lot of this is taken from an article that was in the Atlantic last year. But that is, it is a myth that you can work and go to school and graduate on time. It's just simply not possible. And you can see that most, from this handout, 4 out of 5 college students already work at least part-time. If you look at where we've come and why a lot of folks maybe that end up being in a position to decide how much financial assistance we give tend to maybe be a little bit older and remember when you could work and pay. In 1979, you could work 182 hours, which is a part-time summer job, and pay for a year's tuition. So you could do it. In 2013, it would take you 991 hours, so nearly 8 or 9 times a summer to pay for the same tuition. And keep in mind, we're talking about just tuition. We're not talking about fees. We're not talking about books. We're not talking about where you live. We're not talking about how you feed yourself. So even that is, even assuming you could work 991 hours in a year and complete college that year, you might be able to pay your tuition, but you got to have a little bit more to get through the year. So those students are not going to make it. We can't pretend that they can just make it simply by bucking up and getting a job. Mostly they already do, and if they do, it's simply not enough. So some people might say, well, they could get a Pell Grant. Well, Pell Grants are not what they used to be. The maximum award for a Pell Grant is $5,775, assuming that you qualify for the full amount. That's not going to be enough to get you through. They can get loans. I've got another handout in your packet that talks about, it kind of gives an overview of the student loans that are available and how those work and the limits on those and the repayments and qualifications. And then the last part of that, page 4 of that section, tells you the state of student loans in Georgia. In Georgia, we rank 9th in the nation for students with some kind of outstanding student loan balance. And we're 2nd in the country in the amount of debt per student. So what this tells us is that students are already utilizing student loans. And those students that are debt tolerant are taking advantage of those programs, but that's still not getting us the numbers that we need to get us to that 60% of students crossing the graduation stage and obtaining their higher education degree certificate. So work's not going to do it, Pell's not going to do it, loan's not going to do it. Georgia's been very fortunate over the last couple of decades to have the Hope Scholarship. I've benefited from that and cannot say enough kind words about what that opportunity meant for me and how great it is that we provided that opportunity to students over the year. But we all know that that Hope amount is dwindling, and it doesn't pay what it used to. We know that it's going to be a percentage of tuition, and we know that that percentage of tuition is getting lower and lower every year. And I just wanted to highlight one reason why it is getting lower. And one of the handouts that you have in your packet is it says Hope and Zell Miller Scholars at UGA and Georgia Tech. I'm a proud UGA alum, love that school to death. While I don't love Georgia Tech so much, I appreciate all that they do for our state, and we're very, very fortunate to have such a great institution in our state. So this is not meant to be a knock on either one of those institutions, but those are our most expensive institutions of higher learning that we have here. And y'all all know that in 2011 we separated out the Hope Scholarship. So you have Hope Scholarship, regular Hope Scholarship, which is going to provide a percentage of tuition based on fluctuating lottery revenues. And we know that that stands somewhere between 70 to 90% depending on where you're going right now. We also know that we have the Zell Miller Scholarship, which is a subset of the Hope Scholarship that will provide full tuition for students who graduated from high school with a 3.7 GPA and a 1200 SAT score for their math and verbal sections. Very high qualifying students. Guess where those students go to school, most likely? They go to UGA and Georgia Tech. They go to our highest cost institutions. And what these numbers here show us is that 61.2% of our Zell Miller scholars are going to the most expensive schools. And since they get their money first, because we've guaranteed them a full tuition scholarship, that leaves less left over for regular Hope. And that's just reality, and we want there's merit in awarding folks for merit and for performance, and that's what we do through the Zell Miller Scholarship. But we've got to keep in mind that what that is doing is leaving less left over for the other students, and a lot of those other students that are left over happen to be those ones that are more likely to fall in that lower 25% income quartile and be the ones that we actually need to push and give a little bit more help to get them in the doors of college. So that's a lot of information, and believe me, it's only a thumbnail of what I was thinking about giving y'all, so you can follow up with me later if you want it. But I just wanted to bring that up because we have an opportunity to do something about the staggering difference between the students that are entering college who come from that upper income quartile and those that are in the lower. And it doesn't necessarily have to be because we're all that concerned about helping those students. I think that we should be. I think those students are born into circumstances and they have the right and the ability, and there's no reason to think that they shouldn't succeed and be those students who were meant to go to college. But our workforce demands that they do. We're just simply not going to be able to fill our jobs if we don't start worrying about the fact that they're not going to college. And I think that this casino legislation provides us an opportunity to be very deliberate about how we spend dollars that are available for higher education tuition assistance. And I think we've got right now in the bill a proposed 12% tax that would go to Hope, even though there's a little bit that's going to come out of that for other reasons, and we've got to worry about a little bit of cannibalization from the lottery. But even assuming that 12% goes all to Hope, I haven't seen numbers that show me that we're going to get back to a truly fully funded Hope Scholarship the way we all remember it. And the way we all remember it, or the way I remember it from being a student, was tuition and fees. We're not even talking about that. We'd be lucky to get back to what we were spending in 2011 on tuition alone. And I don't think we get there completely. I would love to be proven wrong on that, but I've tried to find the numbers and they're not there as far as I can tell. So when the committee is considering its recommendations, I hope that what could be done is that folks who are much more good at projecting and finance than I am could figure out what the growing needs would be to provide more fulsome tuition assistance, at least for those in that bottom 25%. And if it could be done across the board, it would be great, but I don't think that it could be. And figure out what that number is, and that's where that tax rate should be. And I think it's going to be, I don't know what it's going to be. I'm not going to pretend to sit here and know the answer to that. I'm a lawyer, and I'm not very good at numbers most of the time because of that. But it's higher than 12. And I'm a sponsor of this legislation, and I do hope it goes forward because I do believe that we need to do something to provide more tuition assistance. But we need to, I think it was said earlier, we need to get it right the first time. And I think those that were here when the lottery was passed in the 90s perhaps know that once you put a number in, it's very hard to go back and make it higher. So I would suggest we start higher, and then somebody can argue to us later why it should be lower. I just don't think it's smart for us to bid against ourselves. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee has.
Chairman Stevens.
Representative Evans, thank you for the presentation, especially the numbers. It has been suggested over a period of time that we consider taking a strong look at the fees that the university system is now charging. And there's been some suggestion somehow that maybe the Hope Scholarship may have enabled some of these fees to escalate to the rate that they are. I think we're 4th in the country now. You might know that, highest in the country. Would you suggest that we ought to run a parallel track with looking at these fees so that we can possibly get them under control? And of course, as you know, student loans now outpace all of our credit card debt. And I'm not sure that we ought to look at those on a parallel track so that we don't just throw more money at a scenario that might need some attention.
Sure, and absolutely, fees are higher than they used to be. I would push back a little bit on the idea that it was Hope that allowed those fees to get so high, because I think if you look at a chart of how the fees have grown, you'll see that they've continued to grow and potentially at some schools grown higher since 2011 when we made the changes to take the fees out of the HOPE award. So that this idea that they were increasing them because they knew they were going to get that money from lottery, I don't think will hold up. And I've got a chart on that that I'd be happy to share with you. But I think one other thing just for the committee to keep in mind, and this is just information, I'm not defending anyone or trying to call anybody out, but UGA and Georgia Tech are where the tuition is going up more rapidly and where the fees are higher. I'm not saying they're the only place, but that's where it's going up exponentially. And we've all seen that from earlier presentations. The acceptance rate for students applying to the University of Georgia is 52%, and at Georgia Tech it's 31%. And I say that to say they don't have to lower tuition. They don't have to lower fees. They've got plenty of people that want to go there. So I think this idea that we could force them to lower that based on what carrot we're holding out with HOPE, I think would be a little bit naive. And I'm not sure that it would be good for the competitiveness of those institutions.
Good point.
I'm not an expert, but that's just looking at the numbers. That's sort of my takeaway on that.
Thank you.
So do you think they're charging too much, tuition too high?
Well, I think that, I mean, if you look at the idea, if you subscribe to the market sets the price, they could go higher. They've got plenty of people trying to go there. I mean, Georgia Tech is turning away 2/3, and UGA is turning away half. So I don't think that.
So is that what you attribute the rise, the explosive growth in tuition to, just because they can?
No, I don't. I just say that to say we just need to be aware that they could.
'Cause I this is something I've thought through a great deal. I mean, we've all seen the statistics about just how rapidly tuition is growing, and trying to put my finger on it and haven't. I'm still kind of wrestling with it. So I was just curious your thoughts. What do you attribute it to?
Competition for students.
So they're just because they're able to charge more, they are charging more.
Well, there are, and this is just me talking here without numbers to back me up, which I don't usually like to do, but the University of Georgia and Georgia Tech are in an elite class of universities now, and that's phenomenal, and we should all be really proud of that. And I think that we would all agree, at least for UGA, HOPE had a ton to do with that, for them to get to this place. But now we've created this world-class university, and so now they're competing for world-class students, and students who have options to go wherever they want to go because they are such high-achieving students. They expect a certain level of amenities and programs and activities at the university that they go to, and so I think that's the main reason that you see tuition and fees increasing so much at UGA. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but I think it's a big reason.
Yeah, the HOPE and the tuition, kind of a chicken and egg kind of relationship you're dealing with there. So, right. Senator Calsert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on that thought, have you given any thought to the possibility by us increasing the funds available for HOPE scholarships that we are putting upward pressure on tuition? Because in my experience, it seems like however much money we pour into that system, it gets soaked out by the university system. And I have a fear of an unintended consequence that, yeah, that's cool for the kids on HOPE, especially back in the days when they weren't paying out of pocket, but are we pricing other kids that aren't eligible for HOPE out of college educations, which defeats what you're pointing out here?
Mm-hmm. Well, to that I would say, and I don't, if this doesn't answer your question, let me know, but that's why HOPE is, we've had HOPE, and we've still been at this 36% number of our population getting a higher education of some kind. So to that I would say we need to consider something. It could either be part of HOPE or it could be in addition to HOPE that specifically targets the students you're talking about, the ones that are potentially getting priced out, to have a little bit more assistance for them. Because at the end of the day, it's not just tuition, and it's not just tuition and fees. It's room and board. There's so much more that goes into the cost of actual attendance. But I think that's what you're talking about whether we're putting that upward pressure because of HOPE. I think you could look at I think if you looked at a chart of tuition rates before and after Hope, and Hope in the early 90s and before and after Hope changes in 2011, you might be able to glean something from that. But I haven't looked at that specifically.
Okay.
But I'd like to. I will now that you've brought it up.
Are you aware of any mechanism that the legislature can implement to control tuition rises, or is that totally constitutionally left up to the regents?
I think the answer to that is that it's left up to the regents, but I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
Senator C.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just wanted to thank you because I think oftentimes we hear about the upper class and we hear about the middle class tremendously, but nobody talks about the lower income people. So I appreciate you bringing that to the forefront because it's very important that we be inclusive as a One Georgia. So thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Smyrie.
Colleague, having seen Hope at its birth in 1889, 90, thereabout.
Not quite that long ago, Chairman.
I was there on the committee, and I think about this so many times over and over and over again. As great as Hope has been, as much it has done for workforce development and preparing our state and keeping our most talented intellectual capital in the state. You know, I think when we started, it was around 180,000 students. Now it's 325,000 students, almost double. It's just no way for those lines to be compatible with each other in terms of revenue and then in terms of expenditures. The revenues are like this, and the enrollment is like, the line is like that. And that's what troubles me, that you know, we started off at 100% thereof. We put everything on the tree, every ornament we could find in 1989 and 90. And I just don't know how we can continue, and back to what the Senator said, I just don't know how we could continue if we don't look at it comprehensively as it relates to not only revenue, but what we, and I remember we used to brag about Georgia's the only state you can get a free education. And it's great. Back then, it was great politics, but poor policy, because we just kind of looked at it. But in all actuality, there's no way for us to keep up with the revenues, with the expense curve of the revenues of the, and as schools and as the institution increases their tuition and room and board, etc., it's just no way to keep up with that financial trail. So the question is it a reality in 2015 to do the same that we did in 1989? I mean, that's a policy issue, but how do we, you know, in hindsight, it would have been good to start at 50% than 100%. Because you can add on, but to take away in politics is the most difficult thing. Even when it went to 90-some%, people just they thought they weren't going to make it in life. But at the same time, I've always advocated that if you have some skin in the game, you realize the value of what you have acquired. And I'm just thinking that until we look at it comprehensively, the whole Hope situation, and collaborate with the university systems in totality, because some are higher, everybody's not ruled by the same yardstick. Until we look at that, I just think that we're going to be just going in this circle in time to come.
I agree with you, and thank you for all the work that you did on this in the 90s. It's just been so important to so many kids. But I think you're right. The enrollment is higher than it's ever been, and it will continue to be. And we hope it will be, because, again, we've got 36%. We need 60%, so we're going to need to grow it. But how are we making sure that we're helping the students who need it, and not simply waving a flag that we've got free education in Georgia? Well, we may have free education in Georgia, but end up with only 30% of our workforce in higher, 30% of our adults obtaining higher education, that's not our goal. Our goal is not free education. Our goal is an educated workforce. So how do we get that? How do we make sure that we're not pricing students out who need it the most, as Senator Cowsert said? And you mentioned, 90%, it's 90% or it's 80%. That's better than nothing. But for a lot of students, that 10% or that 20% is the difference between being able to go or not go. And for some, it's not. For some, they're going to go anyway. There will be a place to make that up. So I definitely think that there needs to be some thought put into that, and maybe a bifurcated system that has some merit component but also some need component, so that we make sure that we're capturing the students that need it the most. I would argue that any student who's in that lower income quadrant, whether they have a fully funded Hope Scholarship, and whether that's tuition or fees, that student in that lower income quadrant will always have skin in the game, because they have got to figure out how to pay for room and board, and they've got to figure out a way to pay for books. And so they are always going to have a loan. They're always going to have to be working. So I don't think that we should shy away from providing full tuition or potentially, hopefully, full tuition and fees at some point if we could for the students who needed it most, because we're worried about their skin in the game, because I think they will. And I share my personal story a lot, but it's all I have. I had everything. I had Hope, I had Pell, I had loans, and I worked as a waitress, and I worked as a telemarketer. I may have actually called y'all, and you may have hung up on me at some point. But that's a lot of stuff. So you take away any part of that, and I'm out, because I don't have anywhere else to go. So I think the students that do need the help the most, I don't think we need to be concerned that much, generally speaking, that they're not going to have skin in the game, because I think that they always will. They have to.
Senator Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I think you bring some valid points, and after all, the name of the committee is the House and Senate Study Committee on the Preservation of Hope Scholarship Program. So your comments are appropriate. I would also add that never in the history of the state of Georgia have so many minority and so many students in the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum had an opportunity for education, and never have they had more getting an education in Georgia. And in Georgia, from Georgia, 130 of the 159 states are represented at the University of Georgia alone. And I think competition is a good thing. If we want to have the best workforce, we need to have the best students. If you want to have the best football team, you start with the best players. And I think that competition that is the unintended consequence or the unintended result of the Hope Scholarship, that's one of those good things. And there are many unintended consequences of the Hope Scholarship. And I think as a whole, they are all very positive. Little towns, little colleges, whether you're talking about North Georgia College or Statesboro or Carrollton, those towns have boomed because students came there on the Hope Scholarship. They had disposable income in their pockets because mom and dad said, since I don't have to pay tuition, I can give you that $150 a month, and you can have that part-time job. Well, $300 a month in your case. But they had that disposable income. Those communities never had dress shops and clothing shops and men's stores and women's stores and restaurants like they do today. And that's generating tax revenue and going back into the community, and it's just all a very good thing. But getting back to the original point, I think the competition is a good thing, whether it's whether we're talking about the pricing, but the academics. Since the Hope Scholarship, since 1998, the average SAT score has risen 200 points. The average grade point average has risen 3/4 of a point. So those are interesting parallels when we talk about the Hope Scholarship. So,
yeah, definitely. Competition is good. One thing I meant to mention earlier that you've reminded me of is absolutely Georgia's done phenomenal work in providing access to higher education for students, but we need to keep in mind that Georgia is one of only a very few, if not one or two, or the only one, of the states that provides no state needs-based aid for students in higher education. And perhaps we haven't in this age where costs are rising and costs are rising, we haven't had to think about it that much because we always had hope, and it used to be full tuition and full fee. So perhaps there was no thought that we needed to do any needs-based aid, but now we don't have that anymore. So that's just food for thought for the committee.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions, and this the kind of the scope of our inquiry the whole time has been really looking at Chairman Stevens and the issues surrounding Chairman Beach's proposals, and this is certainly an issue that we haven't delved into, and appreciate your perspective and helping us as we close out the meeting. It's more to think about as we head into session and talk about the proposals that have been put forth. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
We have one more witness on our agenda, and I think rather than come back after lunch, it probably makes sense to hear from that witness now. I'm getting an amen from members of the committee. Reverend Webb, you're going to get the last word, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
And could you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you, where you're from?
Okay. My name is Willie J. Webb, born in Alabama, Macon County, where Booker T. Washington did his great work down there, and I came to Georgia, went to Morehouse College and some other colleges here, and got a wife, and I had the opportunity to work in a lot of jobs where I could see the fallouts, the things that hurt people. I worked for the state of Georgia for about 16 years in mental health and substance abuse, and worked for Fulton County in criminal justice, and I worked for the state in criminal justice, probation, and parole as well. So I have seen a lot of clients who have been damaged for whatever reason, and I have seen a lot of need for remediation. And so there are three areas where we help people, and that is, one is remediation, and that's when we wait until the person gets harmed or damaged, and then we go in and provide some service. And the other area is prevention, of course, preventing people from getting damaged. And the other one, of course, is promotion, and we neglect that a whole lot. I learned so much being here at this committee hearing, and I certainly appreciate being here, and I've learned a lot. And I want the committee to really, since you're flexible and you do a thorough job, you listen to people and all of that, and that's good. And I would hope that you would give some sympathy to the C students and the D students because they need hope as well. And sometimes we end up missing out on needs-based allocations to people. But the C and D students, they need hope too. They need help too. And I want you to also consider the HBCUs, the jobs that they've done for 150 years. And I'm going to get to my quick presentation here. I got it written down, so I won't take much of your time. But I'm honored to be here. God has blessed Georgia with some of the greatest educational institutions in the nation. God has blessed Georgia, America, with the knowledge, the technology, ethical, moral, and spiritual resources to lead the world. And I know you're thinking globally. It's not a whole lot I can tell you, but I want to leave a few things for you to think about. The world is looking to Georgia and America to set universal quality living standards. The world is looking to Georgia and America to provide standards for global leadership. And we invite people to come here to Georgia and America. And I think one thing we have failed to do is to set standards for people or for ourselves, so when they come, they will become a real part and a helpful part. As people come here, I think some are getting the idea that this is a place where you can do anything, do your thing. So we're going to have to really start setting some standards. These universal standards and global leadership must be undergirded and supported by the best quality education available. If the standards are to be credible and the leadership competent, this committee must establish funding for quality education as a top priority in Georgia through the Hope Scholarship Program. This education is significant, it's vital now. A quality education is essential and vital for human life and quality living in this complex 21st century. That if we fail to provide it, we are guilty of criminal negligence and crimes against humanity. Education is just that vital. Dr. William Glasser, in his book, Schools Without Failure, makes a significant case. He said that educational failure is a major failure. That if you fail in education, you're going to fail in just about everything else. Now, in this technological, heterogeneous, cultural, diverse, and pluralistic society, we can no longer afford the destructive potential of ignorance and evil. We can no longer afford it. It's dangerous. We must not only provide education for the minds of our youth, but we must go a step further. The reason we must go a step further is because it is unwise, irresponsible, and dangerous to educate minds and ignore the ethical, moral, and spiritual guidance of those minds. I am appealing to this honorable committee to resolve to set top priorities with the Hope Scholarship funding to maximize the education of our youth, to educate their heads and their hands and their heart and their health. And Booker T. Washington taught this over 100 years ago, teaching the whole person. And I'm glad to know that you got the flexibility and the interest and the capabilities to be an advocate for education for the youth, because we all need it for them to be helpful and safe members of society. Now, when you do a proper cost-benefit analysis, you will find that ignorance and evil cost much, much more than education. So is money a consideration when you do your cost-benefit analysis? Ignorance and evil are dangerous. I appeal to this honorable committee on behalf of the millions of neglected, ignored, impoverished, misguided, and confused children and youth of Georgia to use your leverage, your commitment, and authority to resolve to wipe out ignorance and evil. If we fail to wipe them out, they will not fail to wipe us out. So it's very, very important what you do and the resources that you have. And I hope that I want to heighten your consciousness on the importance of what you really do. Now, the good news is that I'm a public theologian, and that is that public theology utilizes all of the resources of God that God has given us to help people. We use religion, we use law, we use science, and we use art. All of these can be used to help people. And you're in a position so that we can enhance the development of the minds of our youth and their morality as well. Thank you so much.
Chairman Stevens.
Reverend Webb, I just want to thank you for the challenge. Criminal negligence fits, quite honestly, and we ought to take that seriously. So I appreciate, on behalf of my 6, 4, and 2-year-old, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well, that's it for the agenda. I just want to thank all the members of the study committee for their hard work this summer and fall. We will begin the the business now of summarizing all the information that's been provided to us, and hopefully by the time we get to session, we'll have some good work product we can push out to members of the committee to help us and the folks, our colleagues that didn't sit here through a number of meetings, guide us as we go forward and discuss these proposals in the session. Thank you. We're adjourned.